On August 25, 1942, a Royal Air Force flying boat disappeared into the thick Scottish fog. 30 minutes after takeoff, it slammed into a remote hillside, erupting into a massive fireball that scattered wreckage across the heather. Of the 15 men aboard, 14 died instantly. Among the bodies pulled from the burning debris was a prince. His identity bracelet told the grim story. His Royal Highness, the Duke of Kent. The news sent shockwaves through Britain. Prince George was the younger brother of the King, the uncle of the future Queen Elizabeth. And now, at just 39 years old, he had become the first member of the British royal family to die in active military service in over 450 years. Yet here is where the story takes a strange turn. In the decades that followed, something peculiar happened. Or rather, something didn't happen. No statues were erected in George's honour. No hospitals bore his name. No grand memorials marked his sacrifice. The royal family, usually so eager to commemorate their fallen, seemed content to let Prince George fade into obscurity. There was no official biography, no documentary for decades, just silence. Why would they want to forget a prince who gave his life for his country? The answer lies in what George did while he was alive. Because behind the polished image of the dashing Duke was a man who lived one of the most scandalous lives in royal history, a man whose secrets made his brother Edward's affair with Wallis Simpson look almost tame by comparison. While Edward's romance dominated headlines and nearly destroyed the monarchy, George's indiscretions were far more dangerous. They were hidden, covered up, buried. He broke every rule the royal family held sacred, and when he died, they tried to erase him from history, and the story of the forgotten prince refuses to stay buried. To understand how George became the most whispered about royal of his generation, we have to go back to the beginning. Prince George Edward Alexander Edmund came into the world at 7:35 in the evening on December 20th, 1902. The location was York Cottage, a modest house on the Sandringham estate in Norfolk that his parents inexplicably loved despite its cramped rooms and dark corridors. His father was the Prince of Wales, the future King George V. His mother was Princess Mary of Teck, a woman known for her rigid posture and even more rigid sense of duty. George arrived as the fourth son. Ahead of him in the line of succession stood his father, then his brother Edward, then Albert, then Henry. He was fifth in line to the throne, which in practical terms meant he was nowhere near it at all. The crown would have to pass through 4 lives before reaching him. It was, by royal standards, a position of comfortable irrelevance, and that irrelevance would shape everything. The household George was born into was not a warm one. His father, the future king, believed in discipline above all else. He had been raised in the stern traditions of the Victorian Navy and saw no reason why his sons should be spared the same treatment. Meals were formal, affection was rationed. The children addressed their parents with deference bordering on fear. George's mother, though devoted to her husband and her duty, was not given to displays of tenderness. She collected miniatures and antiques with more visible passion than she showed her children. George had 5 siblings in all. Edward, the eldest, was being groomed for kingship. Albert, the second son, struggled with a debilitating stammer and lived in his brother's shadow. Henry, the third, was solid and dependable, but unremarkable. Mary, the only daughter, occupied her own separate world of expectations. And then there was John. Prince John was born in 1905, 3 years after George. From an early age, it became clear that something was different about him. He suffered from epilepsy and what doctors of the time vaguely described as developmental delays. As John's condition worsened, the royal family made a decision that would seem cruel by modern standards, but was considered merciful then. They sent him away. John was moved to Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate, hidden from public view, raised by a governess far from his siblings. He died in January 1919, just 13 years old, after a severe seizure. The family grieved privately. The public barely knew he had existed. George, watching all of this, understood something fundamental about royal life. You could be erased. If you became inconvenient, embarrassing, or simply too difficult to explain, you could be quietly removed from the story. It was a lesson he would have done well to remember. As a young boy, George stood out from his brothers. Where Edward was restless and Henry was stolid, George was curious. He had a quick mind and a natural charm that drew people to him. He loved music, art, and languages. His tutors noted his intelligence. His mother's ladies-in-waiting adored his wit. In a family that valued tradition over creativity and duty over pleasure, George was something of an anomaly. He asked questions. He wanted to know why things were done a certain way. He had opinions. None of this impressed his father. At 13, like his brothers before him, George was sent to the Royal Naval College, first to Osborne on the Isle of Wight, then to Dartmouth. It was the family tradition. Every prince served in the Navy. Every prince learned discipline, obedience, and the value of hierarchy. The fact that George had no interest in any of it was irrelevant. He hated it from the start. The rigid schedules, the endless drills, the suffocating sameness of naval life. George applied himself at first, as he always did, and his marks were respectable. He excelled at languages and was eventually assigned duties as a French interpreter. But the boredom gnawed at him. The structure felt like a cage. He began writing letters to his father, pleading to be allowed to leave. "I'm not cut out for the Navy," he wrote. "I've tried to make him see, but it's no use." King George V refused. His reasoning was simple and absolute. It had never been done before. No prince had ever left naval service to pursue something else. Tradition demanded obedience, and obedience demanded silence. George would serve whether he liked it or not. A friend of the family, Mabel, Countess of Airlie, recalled George confiding in her during Royal Ascot. He told her he was desperately unhappy. He wanted to join the civil service or the Foreign Office. Somewhere he could use his mind, somewhere he could make a difference. But his father wouldn't hear of it. His only reason for refusing is that it had never been done before, George told her bitterly. "What can I do?" The Countess advised patience. "Work hard," she said. "Complete your service. Pass the civil service examinations on your own. Then present your father with results he cannot ignore." It took years, but eventually the strategy worked. George's health, never robust, began to fail. Severe digestive problems plagued him throughout his naval career. Finally, mercifully, he was discharged. And in a break with centuries of royal tradition, Prince George became the first member of the British royal family to work as a civil servant. He had escaped one cage. But freedom, as George would soon discover, came with dangers of its own. Because in London, far from the watchful eyes of Sandringham and the rigid discipline of naval life, a whole new world was waiting. A world of jazz clubs and cocktails, of forbidden pleasures and dangerous friends. And George was about to dive in head first. When George finally escaped the Navy in 1929, he did what any young prince with money, charm, and no responsibilities would do. He moved in with his favourite brother. Edward, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, kept a residence at York House in London. It was supposed to be a respectable establishment befitting the future king. In reality, it was a bachelor's paradise. Edward filled it with parties, jazz music, and a rotating cast of glamorous women. He drank, he danced until dawn, he flouted every expectation his father had for him. And now George was living under the same roof. The two brothers had always been close, despite the 8-year gap between them. Edward later wrote in his memoirs that George possessed qualities akin to his own. "We became more than brothers," he recalled. "We became close friends." They shared the same sense of humour, the same restless energy, the same impatience with royal protocol. They also shared a taste for danger. London in the late 1920s was a city transformed. The war had shattered the old certainties. Young people who had watched their friends die in the trenches had little patience for Victorian morality. Jazz clubs sprouted across the West End. Cocktails flowed in speakeasies hidden behind unmarked doors. And beneath the glittering surface, a secret world thrived. A world where men loved men and women loved women, despite laws that could send them to prison for it. George discovered this world, and he embraced it completely. It started with the nightclubs. George became a regular at London's most fashionable establishments, often in the company of actresses, socialites, and aristocrats who shared his appetite for excitement. He was seen with banking heiress Poppy Baring, a vivacious young woman his parents deemed entirely unsuitable for a prince. He reportedly had affairs with Hollywood stars and cabaret singers, the actress Tallulah Bankhead, the legendary Florence Mills, Gloria Swanson. His conquest became the stuff of whispered legend, but women were only half the story. In 1921, George met a man who would change his life. His name was Noel Coward. Coward was everything the royal family distrusted: a playwright, an actor, a wit whose sharp tongue spared no one. He was flamboyant, theatrical, and openly moved in circles where homosexuality was an open secret. He was also irresistibly charming. George fell hard. What began as friendship quickly became something more. According to multiple accounts, George and Coward carried on a relationship that would last nearly 2 decades. They wrote letters to each other, intimate letters, the kind of letters that could destroy a prince if they ever became public. And George was not careful. British security services kept files on members of the royal family, monitoring their movements and associations. The reports on George made for alarming reading. According to one account, agents observed George and Coward walking through the streets of London dressed as women, full makeup, women's clothing, 2 of the most recognisable men in England parading through the West End in drag. On at least one occasion, they were allegedly arrested. The charge was suspected prostitution. When police realised they had the king's son in custody, George was quietly released. No charges were filed, no record was kept. The incident was buried. But it wasn't the only one. George's indiscretions piled up like unpaid debts. He reportedly had affairs with the writer Cecil Roberts, a man who also claimed to have been involved with the actor Laurence Olivier. There were rumours about Prince Louis Ferdinand of Prussia, George's own cousin. And then there was Anthony Blunt. Blunt was an art historian, a Cambridge intellectual, and a man who moved easily through the highest circles of British society. He and George allegedly became close during this period. Blunt would later become surveyor of the King's pictures, responsible for the royal art collection. He would also be exposed, decades later, as a Soviet spy. One of the infamous Cambridge Five who passed secrets to Moscow throughout the Cold War. The Queen's own art curator, a traitor, and possibly, once upon a time, the lover of her uncle. George's father knew something was wrong. King George V was not a sophisticated man, but he was not blind. He saw the late nights, he heard the whispers, he understood, on some level, what his son was. According to one account, the king made a dark joke about George's situation. He suggested that his son should be assigned a ballerina as his aide-de-camp, so that nothing scandalous could happen. It was cruel humour, the kind that acknowledges a truth while pretending to dismiss it. The nickname Georgie had once been affectionate. Now it carried a different weight. In certain circles, it became a knowing reference, a wink, an acknowledgement of the prince's open secret. But George seemed almost to enjoy the danger. Where other men in his position might have hidden, he flaunted. He dressed impeccably, favouring elegant suits that became so associated with him that the style was simply called the Kent. He attended the opera, the ballet, the theatre. He surrounded himself with artists and intellectuals, people his family would never have approved of. He lived as though the rules did not apply to him, and for a while they didn't. George was protected by his birth. The press in those days operated under an unspoken agreement. Royal scandals were not reported. Police looked the other way. Embarrassing incidents were quietly handled. The machinery of the establishment existed, in part, to protect men like George from the consequences of their own behaviour. But protection has limits, and George was about to meet someone who would push him past all of them. She was American. She was beautiful. She was connected to some of the wealthiest families in the world. And she carried a nickname that told you everything you needed to know about the danger she represented. They called her the girl with the silver syringe. Her name was Kiki Preston, and she was about to introduce Prince George to a darkness from which he might never fully escape. Kiki Preston was not like the other women in George's life. She was wilder, more reckless, and far more dangerous. Born Alice Gwynne in 1898, she came from American aristocracy. Her family was connected to the Vanderbilts, one of the wealthiest dynasties in the United States. She had money, beauty, and absolutely no interest in respectability. Her first marriage, to a man named Horace Allen, ended quickly. Her second, to banker Jerome Preston in 1925, gave her the name she would carry into infamy. But it was her third association that defined her. She became part of the Happy Valley set. Happy Valley was a community of wealthy British expatriates who had settled in the highlands of Kenya. They were aristocrats, adventurers, and outcasts who had fled the constraints of English society for a place where they could indulge every appetite without consequence. The parties were legendary. The affairs were constant, and the drugs flowed freely. Kiki fit right in. She earned her nickname through her preferred method of administration. While others smoked or snorted, Kiki injected. Heroin was her drug of choice. Delivered through a syringe she allegedly kept polished to a shine. The girl with the silver syringe. It was meant as dark humour. It was also a warning. George met her in the mid-1920s, and the attraction was immediate. Kiki was everything he craved. Glamorous, uninhibited, completely indifferent to the judgment of others. She had reportedly counted among her lovers the legendary silent film star Rudolph Valentino. She collected conquests the way other women collected jewellery, and now she had a prince in her sights. What happened next nearly destroyed him. Kiki introduced George to drugs, not the casual experimentation of a bored aristocrat, but the real thing. Morphine first, then cocaine, then heroin. The prince, who had spent his life searching for stimulation, had finally found something that delivered it directly into his bloodstream. He was hooked almost immediately. The affair spiraled into something darker than mere romance. There were parties that lasted for days, binges that left George unable to function. According to some accounts, the relationship expanded beyond the two of them. Rumours circulated about a ménage à trois involving George, Kiki, and Jorge Ferrara, the bisexual son of the Argentine ambassador to London. Whether true or exaggerated, the stories painted a picture of a prince completely out of control. George's family watched in horror. His father, King George V, had tolerated the nightclubs and overlooked the whispers about his son's sexuality. But drug addiction was different. This was visible. This was dangerous. This could not be hidden forever. It was Edward who finally intervened. The Prince of Wales had always been closest to George. They had lived together, partied together, covered for each other. But Edward recognised that his brother had crossed a line. According to multiple accounts, Edward confronted Kiki Preston directly. The details vary depending on the source. Some say Kiki had suffered a miscarriage, possibly carrying George's child. Others say Edward simply demanded she leave England and never contact his brother again. Whatever the exact circumstances, Kiki departed, but George's addiction remained. Edward took charge of his brother's rehabilitation personally. He arranged for George to be moved to a country estate far from London, far from his usual haunts, far from anyone who might supply him with drugs. A qualified nursing staff was brought in to supervise the withdrawal. George was essentially imprisoned for his own good. Edward wrote about the experience to his mistress at the time, Freda Dudley Ward. His words revealed both his frustration and his love for his brother. "The cure has reached a rather tricky stage," he confided. "I'm carrying out the work of doctor, jailer and detective combined." He added, with evident exasperation, "The old saying, 'boys will be boys,' is all right until you get too old and should know the form better. He seems to lack all sense of knowing what is so obviously the wrong thing to do." The withdrawal was brutal. Heroin and morphine do not release their grip easily. George suffered through the sweats, the shakes, the cravings that must have felt like they would never end. But Edward refused to give up. Day after day, he stayed with his brother. Day after day, he watched over him. And eventually, mercifully, George emerged on the other side. He was clean, or at least clean enough to function, clean enough to resume his public duties, clean enough to be presentable again. Kiki Preston's story did not end as well. She drifted through the following years, her addiction consuming more and more of her life. In 1946, 4 years after George's death, she checked into the Stanhope Hotel in New York City. She never checked out. According to official reports, she jumped from a window. The girl with the silver syringe was gone, but she left behind one final mystery. Rumours persisted for decades that George had fathered a child with Kiki during their affair. The alleged son was Michael Temple Canfield, born in 1926 and adopted by American publisher Cass Canfield. Michael grew up wealthy and well-connected. He eventually married Lee Radziwill, the younger sister of Jacqueline Kennedy. If the rumours were true, that meant a possible son of Prince George had married into the family of an American president. The royal family never acknowledged any of it. They never would. George had survived the drugs. He had survived the scandal, but his reputation within the family was shattered. His father looked at him with disappointment. His mother maintained her usual distance. The establishment that had protected him now viewed him as a liability. Something had to change, and as it happened, they had already found the perfect candidate. George had a problem that no amount of rehab could fix. He had left evidence everywhere. Throughout his years of reckless living, the prince had been remarkably indiscreet. He wrote letters, passionate, intimate letters to his lovers, both male and female. He gave gifts with personal inscriptions. He posed for photographs that no member of the royal family should ever have allowed to exist. And now, scattered across London and Paris and God knows where else, that evidence waited like a ticking bomb. The blackmail attempts began in the early 1930s. One of the most serious involved a French architect with whom George had been romantically involved. The man possessed compromising materials and made it clear he expected to be compensated for his silence. The price of discretion was high. The price of exposure was unthinkable. Buckingham Palace mobilised. 2 emissaries were dispatched to Paris, acting on direct orders from the king. Their mission was simple: retrieve the evidence by any means necessary. What followed was something closer to a spy thriller than royal protocol. the men broke into the architect's apartment. They located a gold box with a personal inscription on the lid, along with several incriminating letters in George's handwriting. They took everything and vanished back to London. The incident was never reported. The architect was presumably paid off or threatened into silence. The evidence was destroyed, and George carried on as if nothing had happened. But it kept happening. The letters George had written to Noel Coward presented an ongoing vulnerability. For nearly 2 decades, the prince had poured his heart onto paper, sending intimate correspondence to the playwright he loved. Coward kept them all. They were precious to him, mementos of a relationship that had defined much of his emotional life. But their existence terrified the palace. In 1942, someone decided the risk was too great. Lord Beaverbrook, the powerful newspaper baron and Minister of Supply, allegedly arranged for the letters to be stolen from Coward's home in Belgravia. The theft was carried out discreetly. Coward was devastated by the loss, but powerless to do anything about it. Years later, Beaverbrook's daughter admitted she had once seen the letters in her father's safe. After his death in 1964, they were never found. There were other incidents, other payoffs, other desperate missions to retrieve evidence from former lovers. A male prostitute in Paris reportedly blackmailed George over additional letters, which had to be bought back at considerable expense. The royal machine worked constantly to clean up the messes the prince left behind. By the early 1930s, the family had reached a conclusion. George needed to be controlled. He needed stability. He needed, above all, a wife. The search for a suitable bride was not left to chance. George had already been romantically linked to several women the palace considered inappropriate. Poppy Baring, the banking heiress, was dismissed despite George's genuine affection for her. She simply wasn't royal enough. What George needed was a princess, someone with the right bloodline, the right connections, and ideally the right temperament to manage a man who seemed incapable of managing himself. They found her in Princess Marina of Greece. Marina was born in December 1906 in Athens, the youngest daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Grand Duchess Elena Vladimirovna of Russia. Her pedigree was impeccable. Through her father, she descended from the kings of Denmark and Greece. Through her mother, she was a granddaughter of a Russian Grand Duke and great-granddaughter of Tsar Alexander II. She counted half the crowned heads of Europe among her relatives. But Marina was more than a collection of titles. She was intelligent, stylish, and possessed of a sophistication that came from a childhood spent in exile. Political upheaval had forced her family to flee Greece when she was young. They had lived in Switzerland, then Paris, moving through the drawing rooms of dispossessed royalty. Marina had learned to adapt, to charm, to survive. She spoke multiple languages fluently. She dressed impeccably. She knew how to navigate a world where nothing was certain. George and Marina first met at a lunch party in 1933, hosted by the society figure Emerald Cunard. The attraction was not immediate. George reportedly found Marina bossy. She found him charming but complicated. But something sparked between them, and they agreed to meet again. When Marina returned to England the following spring, George was among the first to call on her. They went to the movies together. They danced at the Embassy Club on Bond Street. George took her for long drives in his sports car, pushing the speedometer while Marina refused to flinch. They walked in Green Park, talking for hours. Gradually, the relationship deepened into something real. George spoke of her with genuine wonder. "She is the one woman with whom I could be happy to spend the rest of my life," he told friends. "We laugh at the same sort of thing. She beats me at most games, and she doesn't give a damn how fast I drive when I take her out in the car." In August 1934, George flew to Yugoslavia, where Marina was staying with her sister Olga and brother-in-law Prince Paul. He borrowed an aircraft from his brother Edward and piloted it himself. The days that followed were idyllic. Shooting, fishing, long walks through the woods. One evening, after a late-night backgammon game left everyone else exhausted, George and Marina found themselves alone. The next morning, they announced their engagement. The wedding took place on November 29, 1934, at Westminster Abbey. It was the first royal wedding broadcast on radio, and millions across the empire listened as the Archbishop of Canterbury united the glamorous couple. Marina wore a stunning gown of white and silver brocade designed by Edward Molyneux. George, now created Duke of Kent, waited at the altar with his brothers, Edward and Albert, by his side. After the Anglican ceremony, they returned to Buckingham Palace for a Greek Orthodox service. Then they stepped onto the balcony to wave at the cheering crowds below. It was the first time royals had done so after a wedding. A new tradition was born. Britain fell in love with them. George and Marina became the celebrity couple of their age, photographed constantly, admired universally. They seemed perfect together. But perfection, as George had already learned, was just another kind of performance. And behind the fairy tale, the old demons never fully disappeared. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like marriage had saved George. He and Marina settled into a beautiful home at 3 Belgrave Square, close to Buckingham Palace. George personally designed the interior, filling it with art and antiques that reflected his refined taste. Their first child, Prince Edward, arrived in October 1935. A daughter, Princess Alexandra, followed on Christmas Day 1936. George doted on them both, proving himself a far warmer father than his own had ever been. He played games with his children, told them bedtime stories, and made a point of being home for tea whenever his schedule allowed. The Duke and Duchess of Kent became the golden couple of British society. Their parties attracted artists, intellectuals, and aristocrats. Their style was copied across the country. Marina's fashion choices made headlines. George's double-breasted suits became so iconic that the style was simply called the Kent. They were young, beautiful, and adored, everything the monarchy needed. But the world outside their elegant home was growing darker. In January 1936, King George V died after years of declining health. George's eldest brother ascended to the throne as King Edward VIII. It should have been a moment of triumph for the family. Instead, it became a catastrophe. Edward was in love, obsessively, recklessly in love, with an American divorcee named Wallis Simpson. She was twice divorced, sharp-tongued, and utterly unsuitable as a queen. The government refused to accept her. The Church of England refused to bless a marriage to a divorced woman. Edward was given a choice: give up Wallis or give up the throne. He chose Wallis. The abdication crisis of December 1936 tore the royal family apart. George, who had been closer to Edward than any of his other brothers, was devastated. He had socialised with Edward and Wallis, even hosting them at his country home. He had tried to understand his brother's passion. But as the crisis deepened, George's sympathy curdled into rage. According to several accounts, George declared that he wanted to kill Mrs. Simpson. The woman had destroyed his brother, humiliated the family, and thrown the monarchy into chaos. When Edward finally signed the instrument of abdication, George was there as a witness, watching his favourite brother sign away everything for a woman the family despised. The second son, Albert, became King George VI. He was unprepared, stammering, terrified of the role that had been thrust upon him. For a brief moment, there was even talk that Albert might be passed over entirely. His health was fragile, his nerves were shattered. Some whispered that perhaps George, the charming and capable fourth son, should take the throne instead. It never happened. Albert steadied himself, supported by his wife Elizabeth, and began the work of restoring the monarchy's reputation. Edward and Wallis were exiled to France, then to the Bahamas during the war. George maintained contact with his brother, but the closeness they had once shared was gone forever. And then there was the question of Germany. This is where the story of Prince George becomes genuinely controversial, where rumour and evidence blur together into something that historians still argue about today. Throughout the 1930s, a significant faction of the British establishment believed that war with Germany could and should be avoided. They admired aspects of Hitler's regime. They feared communism more than fascism. They believed that a negotiated peace would serve Britain's interests better than a devastating conflict. This group included aristocrats, politicians, businessmen, and members of the royal family. Edward, before his abdication, had been openly sympathetic to Germany. He and Wallis visited Hitler in 1937 and were photographed giving Nazi salutes. His views were well documented and deeply embarrassing. George's position was more ambiguous. According to some historians, George was part of what they call the Anglo-German Peace Group. He allegedly met with Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, during the 1930s. He reportedly held secret talks with Prince Philip of Hesse, who served as Hitler's personal art agent and intermediary in early 1939. The goal, supposedly, was to prevent war through back-channel diplomacy. Then came the night of May 10, 1941. Rudolf Hess climbed into a Messerschmitt fighter plane and flew solo from Germany to Scotland. He parachuted onto a farm, was captured by a bewildered ploughman, and demanded to see the Duke of Hamilton. His stated purpose was to negotiate peace between Britain and Germany. The official story is that Hess acted alone, driven by delusion. Churchill dismissed him as a madman. He was imprisoned for the rest of the war and eventually died in Spandau prison in 1987. But conspiracy theorists have long suspected there was more to the story. Some claim that Hess expected to be received by sympathetic figures in the British establishment, that his flight was not madness, but a planned mission gone wrong, and that among those who were supposed to welcome him was Prince George, Duke of Kent. George was reportedly in Scotland when Hess arrived. Whether this was coincidence or something more has never been conclusively established. The authors of Double Standards, a book investigating the Hess affair, argue that George was part of a faction working with the king himself to negotiate with Hitler behind Churchill's back. Other historians reject this entirely. A recent biography by Glyn Gowans argues that George was actually anti-fascist, that he worked with MI6 on sting operations designed to expose Nazi sympathizers, and that the conspiracy theories are nonsense. The truth remains buried in classified files that the British government has never fully released. What we do know is this: when war came, George served. He was appointed Governor-General of Australia in 1939, but the position was cancelled when hostilities began. Instead, he joined the Royal Air Force, working in welfare and morale. He visited bases across Britain, shaking hands, boosting spirits, doing the unglamorous work of keeping hope alive. He became friends with Franklin D. Roosevelt. When George's third child, Prince Michael, was born in July 1942, the American president agreed to serve as godfather. George had ambitions to become a liaison between British and American forces, a bridge between allies. He had just 21 days to live. On the afternoon of August 24, 1942, Prince George said goodbye to his wife. Marina had given birth to their third child, Prince Michael, just 7 weeks earlier. The baby was healthy. Their other children, Edward and Alexandra, were thriving. Despite the war raging across Europe, life at their country home in Buckinghamshire held a fragile kind of peace. George kissed his wife, held his infant son one last time, and left for London to board a train north. He was going to Scotland. From there, he would fly to Iceland to inspect RAF bases and boost the morale of the men stationed in that remote freezing outpost. It was the kind of mission George had performed many times during the war. Routine, unglamorous, important in its own quiet way. He had larger ambitions. His friendship with President Roosevelt and his connections to American military leaders had sparked an idea. George wanted to become a formal liaison between the British and American Air Forces, a role that would give him real purpose in the war effort. The Iceland trip was meant to be a stepping stone. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the American 8th Air Force, had suggested that George visit American bases in Iceland. If all went well, Spaatz would formally request George's services as a liaison officer. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work George had craved his entire life. He arrived at RAF Invergordon on the morning of August 25th and was introduced to his flight crew. The aircraft was a short Sunderland Mark III, a massive flying boat used for long-range maritime patrols. The crew had been carefully selected. Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, an experienced Australian pilot, was in command. Wing Commander Thomas Moseley, the commanding officer of 228 Squadron, had joined as a courtesy to the Duke. The remaining crew included navigators, engineers and gunners, all professionals, all handpicked for the mission. George had lunch with Group Captain Francis at the base, then was ferried out to the aircraft by marine tender. The crew spent the next half hour conducting pre-flight checks and warming up the engines. Around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Duke boarded. Minutes later, the Sunderland began to taxi across the calm waters of Cromarty Firth. The conditions were not ideal. Low clouds and fog hugged the coastline, limiting visibility. But the weather was expected to clear once they reached the open Atlantic. The flight plan called for them to follow the eastern coast of Scotland north, then turn northwest toward Iceland. A journey of several hours over cold grey water. At 1:10 in the afternoon, the Sunderland lifted off. What happened next has never been fully explained. The aircraft was supposed to fly out over the North Sea, avoiding land entirely. Instead, it turned inland. For reasons that remain mysterious, the plane veered off its planned course and headed directly toward the Scottish Highlands. It descended to an altitude of just 700 feet, flying blind through thick fog over terrain that rose sharply beneath it. At 1:42, barely 30 minutes after takeoff, the Sunderland slammed into a hillside near Dunbeath in Caithness. Hugh Morrison was searching for sheep with his son on the remote moorland when they heard the aircraft overhead. The fog was so thick they couldn't see it. Then came the sound. A massive explosion that shook the ground beneath their feet. A wall of flame erupted into the grey sky as 2,500 gallons of aviation fuel ignited on impact. Morrison sprinted downhill, then rode his motorcycle to the nearest village to raise the alarm. Search parties set out immediately, but the terrain was rough and the crash site remote. It took hours to reach the wreckage. What they found was devastation. The aircraft had struck the rising slope of a hill called Donald's Mount, then cartwheeled across the heather, breaking apart and burning as it went. Bodies were scattered across 200 yards of scorched earth. The impact had been so violent that the plane was barely recognizable as an aircraft. 14 of the 15 men aboard were dead, including Prince George. Dr. Kennedy, the local physician, was among the first to reach the scene. Despite a large gash on the Duke's head, George was immediately recognizable in his flying suit. But it was the inscription on his identity bracelet that removed all doubt. His Royal Highness the Duke of Kent, the Coppins, Ivor, Buckinghamshire. The sole survivor was Sergeant Andrew Jack, the rear gunner. He had been stationed in the tail turret, ironically considered the most dangerous position on the aircraft. When the plane broke apart on impact, The tail section sheared off and Jack was hurled clear, landing in the soft heather while the rest of the aircraft exploded around him. He was badly injured but alive. Jack would never speak publicly about what happened. He was visited in the hospital by senior RAF officials, and whatever passed between them ensured his silence. For the rest of his life, he refused to answer questions about the crash. But years later, his family revealed what he had told them privately. According to Jack's niece, the rear gunner had confided that Prince George himself was at the controls when the aircraft went down. Jack claimed he had dragged the Duke's body from the pilot's seat after the crash. He also said there was an additional person aboard the aircraft, someone whose identity was never revealed and never appeared on any official manifest. The Court of Inquiry convened 3 days after the crash. Its proceedings were held in secret. The families of the 14 victims were not allowed to attend. The official conclusion blamed pilot error. Flight Lieutenant Goyen, the experienced Australian who had flown countless missions without incident, was posthumously found responsible for flying off course and at too low an altitude. The inquiry documents were sealed. Years later, when researchers attempted to access them, they discovered that all records related to the investigation had mysteriously disappeared. The official story was closed, but the questions were only beginning. The news reached Balmoral Castle on the evening of August 25th. King George VI was on holiday with his wife Elizabeth and their daughters when the telephone rang. His brother was dead. The king, who had never wanted the throne, who had been thrust into it by one brother's selfishness, now had to absorb the loss of another. "It came as a great shock to me," the king wrote in his diary. "I had to break it to Elizabeth and Harry and Alice, who were staying with us. We left Balmoral in the evening for London." Queen Mary, George's mother, received the news at Badminton House, where she had been evacuated during the war. She was 75 years old and had already buried a husband and watched one son destroy himself through scandal. Now another was gone. "I could not believe it," she wrote. Despite her reputation for coldness, her first thought was for Marina. "I must go to her tomorrow." She found her daughter-in-law in a state of utter devastation. Marina alternated between sobbing uncontrollably and staring blankly into space, unable to process what had happened. 7 weeks earlier, she had been celebrating the birth of her third child. Now she was a widow at 35, with 3 children under 7, and a husband whose body had been pulled from burning wreckage on a Scottish hillside. The funeral took place on August 29th at St George's Chapel, Windsor. Marina, supported on either side by Queen Elizabeth and Queen Mary, was escorted to her place opposite the high altar. She wore black. She could barely stand. The coffin entered the chapel draped with George's personal standard. On top rested his Air Commodore's cap and a wreath of flowers that Marina had cut herself from the garden at Coppins, their country home. She had placed them there with her own hands, one final gift to the man she had loved. King George VI, not a man given to public emotion, struggled to maintain his composure. "I have attended very many family funerals in the chapel," he wrote afterward, "but none have moved me in the same way." Among the mourners was Noel Coward. The playwright who had loved George for nearly 2 decades sat in the congregation, watching the coffin pass. He had tried to comfort Marina in the days after the crash, but he was himself inconsolable. Later, he would write about the moment the funeral procession moved through the chapel. "When the coffin passed with flowers from the garden at Coppins and Prince George's cap on it," he recalled, "I was finished." 3 weeks after the funeral, the king drove from Balmoral to the crash site. He needed to see it for himself. The wreckage had been cleared, but the scars on the land remained. The ground, for 200 yards long and 100 yards wide, had been scored and scorched by its trail and by flame, he observed. It hit one side of the slope, turned over in the air, and slid down the other side on its back. The impact must have been terrific, as the aircraft was unrecognizable when found. He stood there for a long time, alone with his thoughts, mourning the brother who had been so different from him, and yet so deeply loved.